And we are live with Peter Nemets, the legendary internet historian that some of you may out there in our audience may have heard of. Some of you may not have heard of him, but he is somebody that we're eager to talk to today, and we're hopefully going to have on as a semi-regular guest in the coming months. How are you doing today, Peter?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Excellent. You're coming through loud and clear. We had some technical difficulties the last time we tried to record a couple Fridays ago. So we're very pleased to have you back on. And next time we have you on, as I was telling you off the air, we're going to have you on via Restream. So it's going to be great. We're going to be able to stream our show directly to your Substack if you would like. Folks, you can find Peter on Substack at Peter Nemets. That's Nemets, which is the Russian word for German or foreigner. It's a very old Russian word, over 1,000 years old. So, like I said, we're going to be talking today to Peter about himself, how he got interested in all these topics of ancient and lost civilizations, and more recently, what's happening to our neighbor north of the border. Many of you in this audience are fans of Matthew Ehret and his writings about what's going on behind the scenes in Canada and how the crown is still pulling the strings from the mother country, England. So we'll be eager to talk with Peter a little bit about that. But we're going to start with who is Peter Nemets and what motivated him to start writing about lost civilizations. Peter, go.
Hey, so I've always been interested in prehistory. I was really into dinosaurs, ancient civilizations, even when I was back like 5 or 6 years old. Um, Prior to the ancient DNA revolution of the late 2000s, to the present, a lot of ancient history research, it was, you could rely either on texts or we could rely on archaeology. There were, like, every once in a while, there were new methods that could revolutionizing our understanding of prehistory. Like you've got radiocarbon dating that really comes in middle of the 20th century. You've got dendrochronology, looking at tree rings, that comes in the second half of the 20th century. Every once in a while, there's like a new language that's translated, like Mayan glyphs, for instance. Are translated in the middle of the 20th century, and we've gradually built up a corpus of translated Mayan glyphs. We understand more about their history than we used to. But ancient DNA really shaped a lot more. There's a lot of history in our DNA, and there's even more history in ancient DNA, going back thousands of years when populations were not necessarily in the same places that they are today. So really for the last 17 years or so, I've followed ancient DNA research with a lot of interest. And particularly after 2012, 2013, 2014, when DNA sequencing became much cheaper, there was a massive increase in the amount of available ancient DNA. And this has enabled a lot of synthesis to go on for people who specialize in ancient DNA, for archaeologists, for climatologists, paleobotanists, all these people, all of their forms of research can be synthesized with this new information on population size, on the origins of a lot of peoples, on the magnitude of various migrations in the past, both historic and prehistoric. And it's just been really fascinating to read about.
Do you feel like this is a subject that there's a growing actual popular interest in, that you could actually build a Substack, a paying Substack audience on? And I mean, among other things, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with making money, but obviously you didn't get into this field to make money because you've been doing it for a very long time. I've personally seen your work online, at least for the past, I don't know, 7 years that I've been aware, that I've been off and on following you on X, like many other people. And now more recently on your Substack, reading about what happened in the Bronze Age collapse, which is a topic that, among others, a regular guest in our program, a guy who goes by the handle Veles, who's a longtime federal contractor, you could say. He's kind of a deep state insider. We jokingly call him the Dark Raven of the deep state. Has said that the Bronze Age collapse is not everybody's favorite topic in the archaeological field, as is the field of, let's say, catastrophism in general. I mean, in terms of whether you're talking about the massive flood that happened, anywhere from 10 to 12,000 years ago, that some people call Noah's flood, in the Black Sea, when the Black Sea basin broke into the Mediterranean basin, or when you're talking about the volcanic eruptions that collapsed civilizations several millennia ago around the world almost concurrently, right? Both in ancient China, ancient Sumeria, and in the Mediterranean basin with the Minoans, right? Who built those ancient cities on Crete that have been excavated over the last 150 years. Do you by chance happen to speak German? Because when I had an undergrad classmate at the big burnt orange university, those who are listening will know which one I'm speaking of. I had a classmate who was brilliant, who was studying ancient Greek. He was studying ancient languages. He sort of became an undergrad legend, you could say, because he was sort of kind of like the Goodwill Hunting of ancient languages. He was studying Greek. He was studying Hebrew. He was studying German for the purposes of being able to read Heinrich Schliemann's notes in the original German, right? This was the German, the world famous German excavator
Yes.
who unearthed the city of Troy, which was thought to be mostly legendary up to that point. And it turned out to be a real place that was described in the Homeric epics, even if, maybe the gods and goddesses didn't actually come down and help the warriors destroy, their enemies. But nonetheless, the reason that I wanted to have you on the show is that there's been a sort of renaissance in lost civilizations as a pop culture topic from its, let's say, 1960s or 70s heyday of the post-war era. And it seems to be making a comeback as a topic in the popular culture, alongside, of course, UFOs and aliens and all that stuff, which we won't get into today. But nonetheless, we could sit here and make jokes about ancient aliens. I'm not saying it was the aliens, but it's the aliens, right? Is a meme for a reason. That about them building the pyramids and whatnot. But bottom line is you have Tucker Carlson, who brought on, Graham Hancock, who's been a very controversial figure. A lot of mainline archaeologists have said he's like a quack of archaeology and whatnot. But I'm very interested in what you're writing about, because I think that revisiting catastrophe as a theme and understanding ancient DNA helps us to better understand where we came from and how. And hopefully it also debunks a lot of myths and, let's say, breaks down, racial supremacist, pseudo theories that aren't really rooted in fact, and helps us to better understand where mankind has come from, where we are going. If certain, let's say, shibboleths or popular theories in mainline paleontology, like the out of Africa thesis, for example, might actually be false, right? Maybe modern humans arose in Eurasia rather than in Africa, and then remigrated back into Africa, for example. Just to name one, let's say, central thesis that has been advanced through popular culture, through Lucy and all the skeletons of the various, hominids that Carl Sagan and other pop science figures have advanced down through the decades about our origins and the origins of mankind, and the fact that maybe there were ancient technologies or ancient civilizations that were long lost that were considerably more advanced than we would give ancient man credit for. And therefore, we should be more humble about our current modern technologies, as well as how fragile maybe the situation of mankind truly is. Because, we might have been one Tunguska asteroid away, or one massive series of volcanic eruptions, a few Krakatoas away from really being, in deep doo-doo as a people and as a species. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So that was quite a few points you made. One, I think the popularity of Graham Hancock and all those other types, it shows that there's always been a wide interest in kind of deep history, catastrophic collapses, ancient civilizations, all sorts of things. It's just those kind of people, they take advantage of a vacuum that's left in between academic research So there's all this academic research that's being done that's showing that all this crazy stuff happened in the past, and there's just not enough academics who are translating, synthesizing really all the advances in research into kind of like a truthful, what do we know type books, posts, podcasts, whatever. So that leaves a vacuum for people like Graham Hancock to step in and promote his theories, which, I think are probably 90% false, 10% true.
What would be an example of some of Graham Hancock's theories that you would consider to be false? And then which ones what are the minority of the stuff he's spouting off that you think might have some basis in fact?
I mean, I think like almost all the stuff he says isn't true. The thing that I think of his might be true is that we had kind of like tentative civilizations right after the end of the last ice age.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this kind of catastrophic event, whether it was caused by an asteroid or volcanoes, it's kind of uncertain, which caused what's called the Younger Dryas period. It's like this, ice age after the ice age that's brief. It lasted, I think, like 2,000 years or something.
Yeah.
So
we're talking about somewhere between 10 and 8,000 BC here.
I think it was like 12,000 and 10,000
Okay,
BC.
so even further back. So we're talking even
Yes.
before, let's say, Göbekli, the oldest carbon dated structure at Göbekli Tepe, for example. Just to name like the most ancient site that people have heard of, right?
Yes.
It's pre-pyramids, like by several thousand
Yes.
years, pre-Stonehenge, all that.
Yes, very much
Okay.
so. There are some sites, they're mostly in Israel and Jordan, along the Jordan River, Dead Sea area, that do suggest that there were kind of like proto-civilizations or ephemeral civilizations going back even to 22,000 BC.
Mhm.
And there are some signs in Southeast Asia that there might have been some kind of like very major demographic expansions, which may have been associated with kind of like a primitive agriculture based around the plant taro. It's not that clear, but it would not surprise me if there were some kind of like proto civilizations going on there that later got destroyed.
So
Maybe like
when you talk about a proto-civilization, what does that imply? Does that imply at least some like seasonal cultivation of crops or some kind of dugouts or structures, at least primitive walls for defense against other raiding tribes? What does that imply?
yes, I think these people they were capable of building like palisades. They could dig trenches. They had sedentary settlements. They sustained themselves off of cultivating, some plants that weren't fully domesticated, and
Mhm.
they would deliberately spread their seeds. But they didn't necessarily have like irrigation or that kind
Mhm.
of stuff.
So
Um,
if we're talking 22,000 BC, then it's theoretically possible people have already started to domesticate dogs by this point, right? I
yeah,
don't
I
know about
think
pigs
yes, I think
or cattle.
dogs have been domesticated about 30,000 BC.
Okay.
There's actually some theories which I find very plausible. You're familiar with in Greek mythology, there's Cerberus, right? The three-headed dog that guards the underworld.
Cerberus. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes. So that dog has equivalents in Hinduism. It has equivalents in a number of Amerindian mythologies. There's some equivalents, I think, in Norse mythology too.
Right.
Um, and also some of these Siberian tribes, they also have this idea of this guard dog, which guards the underworld.
Yeah.
Now, that dog, in all these different mythologies, the name translates roughly to spot or the spotted one,
Mhm.
like because dogs have spots sometimes.
Right.
So that's a really odd coincidence, I think, when you have some tribe in like the Rocky Mountains, and they're calling their dog that guards the underworld the same name as the Greeks do.
Yeah.
Um, so this, there's been some people who've theorized that this is a really, really old myth. Because if you go back to like the last common ancestors of the Greeks and the Amerindians, it's this group called the ancestral North Eurasians that were living in Siberia from I think like 40,000 BC, all the way until like 8,000 BC or something,
Mhm.
prior to like the migration of more of the what we would consider East Asians.
Right.
Um,
So
so
this is
these
way before, let's say
Yeah, so this is
the
before like any kind of sedentary civilization, but this
right.
is after dogs have been domesticated.
Okay. And when did the woolly? Let me ask you this because you were mentioning Siberia a minute ago, and I've heard about there's some eccentric Russian centimillionaire who's talking about building, well, not like a Jurassic Park but a Pleistocene park somewhere in southern Siberia where They're going to
Yes.
try to combine the DNA of the woolly mammoths who are perfectly preserved in the what is it called?
The taiga
Permafrost.
or
Yeah, the
permafrost, yes.
permafrost, the taiga, with that where they fell into it like 14 or 15, 16,000 years ago between the last two ice ages or whatever, last three ice ages, I should say. And then, revive them and have the woolly mammoth sort of restoring a proto ecosystem that existed at the time that human beings because I think the out of southern Siberia hypothesis for a large amount of the genetics of Eurasians is a very fascinating one, not only because of course how it ties into Russia and Kazakhstan today, but more to do with I guess genetic studies and how human beings adapted to colder climates to survive, kind of understanding of our common Eurasian ancestry for pretty much the bulk of non-Amerindian and non-African mankind, right? That most human beings, the largest population groups are on the Eurasian landmass, right, or the largest cities anyway.
Yes.
So could you expound a little bit on some of the genetic studies that are coming out of China? And do you think that there might be like some reasons that the Chinese government might be a little bit, reluctant to put everything that they know about ancient peoples out there? Because I've heard this idea that they found mummies in Western Xinjiang that had red hair, right?
Yes.
That are like 3,000, 4,000 years old. So these are like, I don't know, Celtic princesses or something that are being sent to these, Eurasian warlords somewhere in what is now Outer Mongolia or Xinjiang.
That was one of the theories, but the truth ended up being a lot stranger.
Yeah,
So I mentioned you have these ancestral North Eurasians, right?
right,
It's a race that doesn't exist in pure form anywhere in the world these days.
right,
Phenotypically, there's no group today that really looks like they looked. Some of them had like colored hair, colored eyes. Some of them had like more Asiatic features, but they weren't like racially. They weren't.
like paler skin, like not as much yellow in their skin because they,
I mean,
obviously the Han
some of them
Chinese
were
have
just like brown.
have intermixed with people from Southeast Asia for thousands of years. So they
Yeah.
have the further south you go, right, and including on Taiwan, there's more people with the Melanesian, let's say, substrata in their genetics, right?
Yes.
Like compared to the Northern Han, who are like, they look more Jurchen, almost, like not quite like the Manchus who ruled China
Yes.
for centuries, but you know what I'm saying? They're
Yeah.
bigger, they're stockier, they look more stereotypically Mongoloid when we think of big strapping Mongol warriors.
Yes. I mean, going back though to the Paleolithic, there wasn't that much selection at a genetic level being done on a lot of these hunter-gatherer groups. So humans were everywhere, like even in the far north, a lot darker than we are today. Like for
Right.
Europeans,
You're talking about Cheddar Man, this guy they dug up in the UK who's several
yeah,
thousand years
and
old.
just everywhere too. Like
Yeah.
far northern peoples, we kind of would have been maybe like Inuit level in skin tone on average, but there still would have been variants. There would have been some people who were really dark. There's some people who were really fair. It's only like really the last 4,000 years that East Asians and Europeans started to get whiter. And
Yeah,
that process,
I find it fascinating, not to interrupt you, but too much, but that blonde hair may have come out of Siberia. That's a very fascinating thing. Or blonde haired, blue eyed people might have those genetic traits may have become more predominant in Siberia before they became associated in our minds with, let's say, more modern Nordic peoples, Finns and Swedes, and let's say Northern Russians who have more of those, Ugric genotypes.
I think a lot of the genes for like light skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, they existed when humans made the out of Africa migration like 70 or 80,000 years ago.
Hmm.
It's just they were very rare. Like
Right.
they got it took a while for them to be selected for. So it was natural selection on basis of extant genetic variation. That's the scientific way of describing what happened. So you do see like people in the Middle East, people in Melanesia and stuff that occasionally they'll have blonde hair, blue eyes, even though they don't have necessarily any European ancestry, and that shows up in the ancient DNA two, even prior to the Indo-European conquests. Like you do have blonde-haired, blue-eyed people in the Middle East, and you have some really odd combinations. Like there were people with kind of like dark brown skin but red hair in the Middle East, and it was uncommon, but it did happen. So things have definitely, like the races and the phenotypes of today are definitely not the way they were, even 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, even in the time of Christ, when we're talking about the fact that, for example, and this is a little bit of a touchy subject because it touches on the current Middle East conflicts and, let's say, the rising tide of anti-Israel sentiment all around the world. But the fact of the matter is that Ashkenazi genetics are predominantly, how do you say this, Italian, Mediterranean, because, and that is not surprising because even in the time of Jesus Christ, the majority of the Hebrew people had already scattered or were living outside of the Holy Land, right? And you had massive Jewish populations, 10,
Yes.
15, 20% of the population of Alexandria in the first century is Jewish. Even 10% of the population of Rome, probably by the end of the first century, I would take it before Titus expelled the Jews or something, or started expelling them, was Jewish, right?
I think some of those statistics are actually exaggerations.
Yeah.
It's just like unreliable classical age sources that have been taken for granted and kind of.
Because I've heard there are restrictions on genetic testing in Israel by law, right? I don't know if that's true, but I've heard that and people are like, because that's why they don't want to admit that they're basically, Med-Italians or whatever, Levantinized Italians, what have you, right? Because they want to say that, well, our ancestors have been here for 2,000 years, and there are Sephardic Jews who can claim honestly that their ancestors have been at least in the Middle East for 2,000 years in, what are now the Fertile Crescent, Arabic-speaking lands, or in Egypt. Their Jews have obviously been there for over 2,000 years, even before that. So, I mean, it's what I'm trying to say is that it's sometimes talking about ancient genetics can get you into touchy areas, right? Like if you're talking about why there are so many, tall, really tall, sometimes Slavic featured Turks, for example, or Turkish women who look a little more, let's say, Slavic in their appearance, right? Because then you start getting into historic patterns of conquest and, what's on the Y side of the genetic heritage versus the X chromosome side, right? In some cases, it turns out to be exactly what you expect. If you look at modern Azeris, for example, you're going to have Turkic males and you're going to have more common Persian genetics on the female side. Likewise with the Hungarians, right? It's, they've got those ancient Eurasian haplogroups, right, on the male side of the lineage, and the male bodies that have been excavated in the Pannonian Basin from the early generations of Hungarian Magyar conquerors. But then on the female side, unsurprisingly, it's pretty much Slavic and Germanic, which explains why the Hungarians look the way they do today, right? You don't run into very many Hungarians who look, who have that sort of characteristic Asiatic, eyes.
I like the Finns.
It's not like in Russia where, occasionally there are some Russians you meet who look very Tartar, right?
Yes, very much.
And even within families, like I've met Russians who one of the males in the family looks more like he's got a Tartar ancestor versus the others. The females don't look. It doesn't seem to manifest as much. I mean, genetically, Russia obviously is a gigantic melting pot, but especially when you talk about the prevalence of red hair in the Chuvash peoples, for example, or other features, and the fact that I just find it fascinating that the ancestors of the Hungarians, the Magyars, came from what is now we believe the Republic of Bashkortostan in the Urals of Russia, right? That's kind of fascinating in its own right.
Yes.
But it's just my point being that ancient genetic studies can sometimes get you into trouble, but on the other hand, sometimes they seem to confirm what a lot of people already suspected or knew, particularly when you're talking about the Indo-Aryans, conquering India, right, several thousand years ago. You had more darker skinned people. And then, this Indo-Aryan Vedic civilization comes in from the Iranian plateau and the steppes of Central Asia, and really maybe even up to including the far eastern edge of the Pontic steppe between the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains. I mean, north of the Caucasus Mountains, I should say, where, all the way to the Volga River, where you now have the city of Volgograd, where they have all those kurgans, right? So it's really fascinating to me, because I personally think that selection pressure is real, natural selection is real, but the fundamental Darwinian premise is false, right? So it's an interesting contrast, because obviously I'm not a young Earth creationist, and I don't believe that you have to be to believe in the Bible as an inspired word. But the Bible is not a scientific textbook, as a lot of literal biblical creationists try to turn it into. But at the same time, Darwinism in its purest form is turning into kind of a failed religion, a secular religion, in my opinion. So we have this whole realm in between of ancient genetics and ancient catastrophism, particularly the flood myth. Obviously, the biblical flood is another thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on, because I don't know if you've done a lot of reading on the subject, but the idea that there was a catastrophe whereby the waters of the Black Sea, broke through to the waters of the Mediterranean, and basically may have flooded the Near East is a very interesting topic in itself.
Yes, very much so. Like, how much of the Old Testament, and indeed the New Testament, can be historically, archaeologically, genetically verified is a very interesting
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, and you see this now. I mean, again, not to get too deep into the Israel-Palestinian conflict, but you see it now with a lot of the Palestinians claiming that they are the descendants of the Israelites who were in the Holy Land at the time of Christ, right? And then many of them converted to Islam because the Muslims maybe in certain cases made allowances or moderated Islam to emphasize their respect for Mary and Jesus more, even though if that was already there from the beginning as an element of the religion. That's a whole complex subject in of itself, because there's this topic of as I heard once when I went to Israel, the one time I went to Israel, a rabbi saying, I can pray in a synagogue and a Muslim can pray in I can pray in a mosque and a Muslim can pray in a synagogue, but neither one of us can pray in a church, right? Because neither one of us believes that Jesus was God or the Son of God, right? So
Yes.
it's an interesting how do you say, triangle between the three monotheistic religions, in the sense that the Judeo-Christian aspect that has prevailed since the mid 20th century, especially after World War II and the mass persecution of the Jewish people in Nazi-occupied Europe, has started to break down, right? In our time, like we're seeing, unfortunately, with it coming a lot of anti-Jewish hatred online, but also some realization that maybe some things that were fabricated after the war for the purposes of, religious tolerance and what have you, and having a sort of common Judeo-Christian public square, have started to break down for a wide variety of reasons: demographic, education, people getting, more of their understanding of the world from the internet rather than from teachers and from authority figures. And also, of course, what's been happening in the Holy Land the last, especially 2.5 years, particularly since October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel of October 7th, and Israel's massive and very violent response. So that has been aided by the United States government. So I think that this has really become a super timely topic in more ways than one. And it also, the common Eurasian ancestry helps to break down, some of the, let's say, attempts to, there's all these internet memes. You've probably seen them where people are like, "We don't want your kind here," where it shows a Mexican guy on the Mexican side of the border
Oh yeah.
with a Mexican flag behind him and the U.S. flag.
Yes.
They look the same, or they don't want you the same. We don't want your kind here with a South Korean who's talking about the Chinese, and so forth. And it amuses me when they try to, let's say, revive old prejudices, or the Ukrainians talk about how they're honorary Europeans and Herrenvolk, and the Russians are these Moscow orcs from somewhere in the Eurasian pot, and and then you realize that a very large percentage of the people living in northern Russia have some form of Finnish ancestry, at least the northwest part of Russia. And it sort of, let's say, becomes almost comical, the attempts to invoke race as a kind of tribal justification for current conflicts.
Yes, because I mean Ukrainians have a lot of that ancestry too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, genetically, it's almost, there's practically no difference between a person a random person you find on the street in Kiev versus somebody you find on the street in Belgorod. And you might find more variance the further northeastern you go in Russia, right into the taiga, right? If you go to what's the capital? I'm thinking of the Mariel Republic, for example.
Oh, Yoshkar-Ola.
Yeah, Yoshkar-Ola. Thank you. Somebody who knows their Russian geography very well, which we could talk about next time you're on the show. We'll get more into Russia and Russian history, because it's also fascinating in many ways. But yeah, when you find a random person for Yoshkar-Ola, or the heritage may look a little bit different, because you might have a stronger Finno-Ugric or Northern Eurasian component to their ancestry, compared to just kind of good old straight up Slav, haplogroups. When my dad did his 23andMe a few years ago, it came back, not surprisingly, 2/3 German, but it was there was like a third, I think, that was euphemistically labeled Eastern European. And I told him, "Well, Dad, that's your proof of what I already suspected, that we're basically Germanicized Slavs somewhere in the woodpile," right? And you talk about the Slavic heritage of Germany is another fascinating topic for me, because whether you're talking about the Vendish or the Sorbs, Sorbs, these sort of
Yes.
tiny legacy Slavic groups that have survived centuries of Germanization and assimilation into the broader Germanic whole. And I find that topic fascinating too.
Yes, all the Eastern European population movements really are fascinating. I'm actually working on a Substack piece on it right now.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more? Can you elaborate as a preview what you've found?
Sure. So you have the initial Indo-European conquests, about 3000 to 2800 BC. And then the Indo-Europeans, they start to fragment. You have the Indo-Iranians in the Far East, like modern day Oka River to, the Volga and the Kama. It's like the ancestors of the Indo-Iranians, like all those groups that end up conquering Iran, India, Central Asia,
Right.
all that. And then in the Far West, kind of just north of the Dnieper River, just east of the Rhine, you have the ancestors of the Italics and the Celts. And in between them, it's kind of a mystery. Like the ancestors, the Greeks and the Armenians, they're in Ukraine still for a couple of hundred years before they get kicked into the Balkans and the Caucasus.
Right.
The Slavs, from what I can tell, they're kind of a merger of three separate groups. There's, the very eastern end of this group that the Tirsinich culture, which might have had like some ties to the Italo-Celts in southern Germany and Czechia. Then it's got
and would these be the ancestors more of the Serbs and those super tall Montenegrins that everybody notices how Montenegrin guys are tall?
These would be like 30-40% of their ancestry.
Yeah. Continue. Sorry.
Yeah, so you have kind of like the very eastern part of the Italo-Celt group. You have the western part of the Indo-Iranians. And around 1700 BC, you have this migration from these Baltic people that have mixed a lot with the local fishermen. And they go and they migrate down to what's nowadays like southern Belarus, north central Ukraine, and they mix together and they form, what I think are the original Balto-Slavs.
Right.
So they go and they kind of hang out there for a few centuries. They're under heavy Iranian influence. So you do see some stuff like all the way to Scandinavia, which shows that like the Iranians from Central Asia were like, exchanging goods through, whether like raids or through trade, with people as far west as Scandinavia.
Yeah, this is another really fascinating topic is ancient trade routes, right? Because even before the founding of Kiev, you had Pskov and Novgorod existed as trading posts. Baltic amber was very prized, even in ancient Rome.
Yes.
Even the ancient Greeks were getting it via the Black Sea trading posts that the Greeks set up, even in the centuries before Christ. We're talking about even in the time of the Peloponnesian War, there were colonies, Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast. Chersonis being perhaps one of the most famous that subsequently developed into the Byzantine era. And also you had Trabzon on the northern coast of what is now Turkey, also was a major trading post, and even survived briefly, I think, as a Greek Byzantine outpost after the fall of Constantinople itself for the Republic of Trabzon. I think it was for 2 decades before it basically ceased to be a Ottoman vassal or Turkish vassal, just basically got fully absorbed by the Turks. But just so you know, Veles is actually listening to the program. He checked in a few minutes ago in the comments. So we're happy to have you out there listening to us about talk Slavic stuff and deep Slavic roots, Veles. Very much so. Let me ask you something, because
Sure.
I feel like, they used to say that anti-Catholicism is sort of the last respectable prejudice in, elite Anglo-American circles. I almost feel like that's not true, and that almost it's become like anti-Slavism has sort of become fashionable to a certain degree on both the left and right for different reasons. There's a viral video of Nick Fuentes that some people like to jokingly call him Burrito Mussolini because as a slur at his half Mexican origins, what have you. But and the guy's like whiter than a lot of white people in terms of being brown haired and lighter eye color and whatever. But it's funny because he's sitting there making a rant about the Slavs and how they're not really white because they eat potato dumplings or something. And it went viral on a lot of Russian shit posting Telegram channels that I occasionally allow myself to doom scroll through. But it's funny because it's as if you almost have to say Slavic lives matter, whether especially Eastern Slavic lives matter, because it's as if Slavic lives have been made less relevant or important to the powers that be, going back really to the Balkan Wars of the 90s. I would argue is when it kind of started, that Serbs were these like wild, savage Slav men, who were persecuting all the poor Muslim Bosniaks and Croat, almost honorary Italian Croats because they're Catholic and what have you, and their ancient ties to the Vatican. But yeah, do you feel like Slavic lives have been sort of cheapened, especially since the start of the Ukrainian war? Because it's like Ukrainian men, General Keith Kellogg's daughter was confronted about the press gangs dragging the Ukrainian men off the street to the screams of their women and neighbors. And, she was like, well, the country's at war and it's existential. So, these men are dodging their duty. So, they kind of deserve to get dragged off, was kind of her response on X to these people. And I feel like this is just me going on a bit of a rant here, but I feel like the thing that our country has in common, the most in common with the Third Reich right now, is the devaluation of Slavic life, particularly Eastern Slavic male lives, whether Russian or Ukrainian. because the Ukrainians' duty is like to fight and die, so NATO doesn't have to, overtly at least. And the Russians, they're bad, so they kind of deserve it anyway. Your thoughts on that, sir?
Yeah, I mean,
that rant of mine.
Sure. I think, like hate, prejudice, all that stuff is ultimately like biologically rooted. It doesn't go away from anti-hate education or whatever.
Yeah.
Just gets transferred into acceptable targets. So Southerners, Slavs, Muslims, when it's convenient for the foreign policy.
I call it the taxonomy of bad whites, right? Like there's a taxonomy of bad whites in our culture. Like there's bad MAGA whites, especially MAGA Southerners and Texans. There's bad whites, Afrikaners from South Africa. They're like the next level of badness, like Elon Musk, and more to the point, those guys who are building the Afrikaner communities, right? I forget what they're called, but you know the ones I'm talking about.
Oh, like Iranian stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, the Afrikaner autonomous, let's call them. They're not trying to be anti-black or anti, South African majority. They're just trying to have their own autonomous communities that can be protected. They don't want to leave South Africa. They're like, hey, my ancestors have been here for 320 years. I'm not leaving, right? I'm not going to Russia. I'm not going to Argentina or Paraguay or wherever, or the United States. Thank you very much, Mr. Trump, for the refugee visa, but no thanks. And then the worst whites of all, the worst white people of all in the taxonomy it's like that comedian joke, the Russians are the scariest white people. You've ever seen that
yes,
routine
yes,
on YouTube? Yes. So Russians are the worst white people, right? They're like the worst white people. And then Ukrainians, they sort of get this weird exception, right? And it's not even the whole Galician, honorary Herrenvolk thing that goes back to the Habsburg Empire, when they needed to explain to the Greek, not only the Greek Catholics, but especially the Orthodox Ukrainians, why they were so much different and better than the Ukrainians living on another side of a border in the Russian Empire, right? Like they had to sort of invent a difference, what made their identity radically different somehow, right? Whatever.
Yes.
So empires do that all the time. I'm not saying it's some unique evil that was stamped on the Ukrainians. I'm just saying that in general, you see that all the time, right? Like there are Turks who look very white. There are Greeks who look very dark. And yet the Greeks are like, hey, you're black ass Turkish Muslims. And, and the Turks make fun of that a lot. Actually, when you read some of the pro-Turkish Eurasianist channels, they love to make fun of that aspect. And I actually kind of find that a little funny myself, because, I didn't know that much about Turkeys and Turkish pop culture, or how, very Mediterranean and fair-skinned a lot of the Turkish actresses looked, right? Especially the 60s and 70s and 80s movies that, you see when Turkey was more officially secular than it is now. So the point being that I just wanted to get that out of the way as a point when I had you on this show, first off, to, talk more about the Slavs and the popular imagination, the American imagination now, because, and especially the British as well, Western European thought, because I hope and I pray that one of the positives that will come out of all this ancient genetics and studies is to, like I said, affirm a more cosmopolitan and genuine appreciation of our differences, even if they do run more than skin deep, versus, the fake sort of kumbaya-ism of the left, which tends to deny our tribal human nature, right? Yes. Like this idea that nationalists all have to hate each other is false, right? Like nationalists actually sometimes get along better because they're more honest about their differences than, people who've been, who have to sort of spout the pleasantries of the pseudo left. I mean, look at these Valkyrie women who are running the EU right now, as Kaja Kallas and these people, as kind of a case in point, right? Like they've suppressed their hatred of the Russians for so long, but yet now it's like all coming out in these sort of stupid ways, or them saying stupid things, right? Like what did Russia have to do with winning World War II? Like they're trying to convince everybody that they played the lion's share of victory in Europe. Well, yeah, because they did. 80% of the German army was killed in the Soviet Union, predominantly on the territory of Soviet Russia. Like, I'm not saying there wasn't bloody fighting in the Ukraine and Belarus, but I'm saying, like, that's where most of the Wehrmacht died. When you look at it, is on the territory of the Russian RSFSR. So, and then I guess more recently, another stupid example would be what's his name, Tusk, saying that blowing up Nord Stream was great, and we should let this Ukrainian patsy guy that has been in custody for a while go, or it was good to let him go. I don't even know if the guy is actually in custody at the moment, or if they put him in a car with Ukrainian diplomatic license plates and let him go, back to Ukraine. But my point is, it doesn't really matter if the guy's a patsy or not. It's more to do with the fact that if you're saying it's okay to blow up one piece of the infrastructure because it hurt Russia, well, why not just say it's okay to blow up Turk Stream next? I mean, hell, let's just blow up anything and everything that benefits Russia, even if it's a form of economic suicide for Europe. And by the way, it also creates hostilities between European states. I mean, it raises the possibility, however remote and absurd it may seem to us at this juncture, that Europeans might one day kill each other again in large numbers without any direct American or Russian involvement at all, just indirect involvement.
Yes, there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, the war has definitely not been great for anyone.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think Veles put it best when he said something like recently on a podcast that, I'm of Slavic descent, and I don't like that the London Corporation and, all these NATO people are basically devaluing Slavic lives. I mean, I just want Russians and Ukrainians, in the words of President Trump, to stop dying, right? It's not war doesn't always determine who's right. It often determines who's left standing when all the things are going off. And, I'll finish the riff on the Russia-Ukraine war by saying this, that you had a lot of people in the last 2 weeks who were really gloating about Ukrainian drones blowing up some of the refining capacity of Russia. Now, people can debate and discuss how much of an impact on the Russian economy that's really having. Seems like it's having something a bit more of a bite than a lot of pro-Russian people would like to admit, but far less than the Ukrainian side and the NATO people are claiming. Somewhere the truth seems to be somewhere in the middle. But my point is, it's like you're cheering on a dude attacking another guy with a chainsaw, who the guy who's being attacked has a shotgun, right? It's like you're at the risk of quoting Tony Montana, or the other character who's played by the other guy who later starred in Breaking Bad as the Mexican cartel leader, never bring a chainsaw to a gunfight, right? And that's what's happening. Like, the Russians just blew the crap out of the Ukrainian grid over the last 2 nights, right? Like, there's just massive rolling blackouts across northeastern Ukraine, which is bad for everyone. It's certainly bad for civilians. You got a fridge full of spoiled food soon if they don't restore your power.
Yes, I mean, the Ukraine is very tragically a crossroads, which means that all the different powers want to pass through, and the result is it gets wrecked and depopulated every few centuries. That's certainly what it looks like is going to happen in this century as well.
Like another, what did they call it?
The ruin.
The ruin, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, the Ukrainian, and I think the Polish historians, what did they call it? The similar period?
The deluge.
The deluge, thank you. So it's like we're headed for another ruin and deluge in Central Eastern Europe. And it would not surprise me in the least if the net result is probably some strange revival of the Respolitica, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Peter, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Yes.
Because it seems like the Lithuanians should be far more worried about their people coming back and having babies than they should be about the prospects of the Russian army coming through the Suwalki Gap. That's just my personal opinion. I don't live in the Baltic states, but if I did, that would be my concern.
The issue with the Baltics is more that they have these large Russian minorities with very obviously split loyalties at best.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, quite a few of them are just outright openly loyal to Russia. They go
Sure.
to conferences in St. Petersburg, Pskov, Moscow,
Yeah.
all other places saying that, we want to rejoin the motherland. So one of the things that we really should have been pushing for a long-term peace is the compensated repatriation of the Baltic Russian population, as well as the purchase of Kaliningrad, whether for Poland, Lithuania, or Germany, just to finally resolve those issues.
Well, I remember, I think it was on the table in the early 90s. Maybe Veles could confirm this to me off the air, but there was talk, at least during the Yeltsin years, of the Germans making an offer, just like Japan wanted to buy some. Well, I think Japan did offer money for the Sakhalin, if not Sakhalin itself, then certainly the Kuril Islands that the Soviet Red Army conquered at the end of World War II, like they conquered Kaliningrad, what was then East Prussia, Königsberg, and drove out the German population. So my personal opinion is there should be some form of maybe, in the longest term, if Germany ever got based and sensible and sane again, maybe you turn Kaliningrad into a kind of binational territory like Spitsbergen or something, or you just turn it into didn't they tried that during interim of World War II, right? After World War I, they created the free city of Danzig, right? But it was sort of stuck behind Poland, so that didn't really work very well. But maybe in a saner, more peaceful late 21st century, some form of historical reconciliation will be possible. Although I doubt it. It may take handing the Falklands back to Argentina first or something. There are a lot of or Gibraltar back to Spain. I mean, there's a lot of places in the world where you look at them and you say, well, this whole exclave is sort of a certain historical legacy of a power mismatch, let's say, from a certain era that may not make sense forever and ever, but certainly it has to be resolved in a peaceful way, right? It can't be at a gunpoint. Obviously, I think the Malvinas should go back to Argentina, but I am not in favor of the Argentines having a go at it militarily again, right? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Unfortunately, a lot of these conflicts have a tendency to drag out in the post-war period. I mean, like, we're still embargoing Cuba, 64 years later?
Insane.
So unfortunately, it's politically impossible to make the kind of concessions that the Russians would find acceptable to permanently resolve the conflict in Eastern Europe.
Right.
So
like if there were no NATO, right? Like if there were no NATO, maybe it wouldn't be a problem, right? Like maybe Transnistria could become a part of Russia, and then pretty much the rest of Moldova would go to Romania, right? Like the Russians and Romanians would sit down and make a deal if there were no NATO, right? If there were no British or American, or French even people sitting on their backs, leaning on them, on the Romanians' backs, right? Because look, I mean, how is it possible that Romania, they were about to elect somebody like Kalin Georgescu, right, as recently as December of 2024, and yet they're still like, no, they wouldn't allow him to get elected, and they're still building up as this big NATO base and anchor in southeastern Europe and on the Black Sea, and basically maybe making contingency plans. I mean, they've already basically torn up. Moldova's neutrality is obviously a joke. It has a constitutional neutrality. Ukraine tried that, I believe, to have constitutional neutrality. And obviously the EU and NATO are, in lockstep, arm in arm, to get rid of that and basically make Moldova maybe a co-belligerent state with Ukraine, or maybe some kind of entity that will get snap Anschlussed in the future if the Russians ever get close to Odessa, if they even hint at taking Odessa, right? Like, you think, well, they're just going to roll through Chisinau and keep rolling right into Odessa with, whatever the French and British airborne divisions will just roll right through, right? Because nobody, when the chips are down, is going to give a damn about the legal niceties of either Moldova neutrality or the fact that Transnistria, according to NATO, is still a unrecognized Russian-occupied territory of Moldova, right? They're just going to take it, right? I mean, I was actually surprised that the Ukrainians didn't actually attack Transnistria. Instead, they just sent their best men and armor right into the freaking Russian minefield where the Russians expected them to attack, and probably the most telegraphed ground attack of the 21st century in the summer of 2023.
Yes, it was pretty obvious, especially once the Prigozhin-Wagner pseudo-coup happened and the Ukrainians weren't able to take advantage of it, that the much vaunted summer offensive was a dud.
Yeah, and let me ask you one final question about that, because I I personally start to wonder, in the light of Prigozhin's failed putsch rebellion, if people could take another look at the whole battle of what was it, Kashem, where the Wagner guys got killed, were supposedly just for no apparent reason, or maybe out of greed because they wanted to take over a gas field that the Americans held, the Conoco gas field. They decided to suddenly just start firing shots over the heads of the Americans. My personal opinion is they weren't trying to kill any Americans; they were just trying to drive them off. But it seemed to have obviously backfired spectacularly, to the point that you almost wonder, okay, if Prigozhin later showed his true colors by revolting against Moscow, is it possible that Prigozhin was some sort of foreign asset all along? Maybe not of MI6 or the CIA, but maybe, let's say, of a certain intelligence service in the Levant, of a certain U.S. ally in the southeastern Mediterranean. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm pretty skeptical. I mean, look at how big his career in Syria was and how
Yeah,
much money Wagner made there. That was certainly not in Israel's interest. It was strongly
yeah,
against Israel's interest.
sure.
Um, so, I'm very doubtful that Prigozhin was anything other than what he claimed to be.
Yeah, I mean, Kashim just I look back on it and I just think of it as some sort of it almost looked like the kind of thing that a Bond villain does, to get Russians and Americans to kill each other, right? Because otherwise, it really makes little sense to me, either tactically or strategically, why, even a group of Wagner guys, let's say, who killed a lot of Ukrainian soldiers in the Donbass and had some, easy victories over Toyota technical jihadists, would come up with the idea one day that, okay, we're just going to fire a bunch of arty rounds and mortar rounds over the Americans' heads, and they're just going to run off, and they're not going to call for air support, and we're not going to get slaughtered. Like, the whole thing still doesn't make sense to me in from that perspective, right? Like, how could the Wagner guys have been so unrealistic and stupid?
I mean, some of the Wagner guys, they were, recruiting, members of the security forces,
Yeah.
random right-wing
These are
paramilitary
these are
guys,
not these are but
criminals.
my point is, these are not unsophisticated hicks from the middle of nowhere. These are not 19-year-old dumbass kids.
Well, a lot
Right.
of them are. Like, that's
Yeah.
the issue.
Okay.
They definitely built up experience with time, but especially in the beginning, Wagner was definitely not comprised of elite human capital.
Yeah. No, I mean, not when you're recruiting out of the jails and you're getting people who are trying to get a drug rep in Chelyabinsk or someplace, purged
Yes.
from their record. They tried to sell a little weed, a little crystal meth or something in a club in Chelyabinsk. He got busted. I mean, that's that's definitely not elite human capital for the grunt trigger pushers, for sure, especially in the Battle of Bakhmut, which is, I mean, that's like the little Stalingrad of the 21st century, right there. That you had some of the best Ukrainian soldiers dying in combat with the convicts that Russia at that time was willing to push forward. But obviously, that policy changed. Part of why Prigozhin, I've understood, revolted is he wasn't getting as much money he wasn't getting as many of the convicts in his pipeline anymore, even though he pitched a tantrum and claimed it was all about the shortage of artillery shells, and the Russian MOD wasn't supplying him with enough rounds. That wasn't actually true. They were shutting down a lot of his big money making schemes, and Wagner itself wasn't going to be getting that amount of meat anymore. From what Stanislav Krapivnik has told me about it, from his conversations with people, let's say on the periphery of the Russian Defense Ministry and people in the know in the Donbass. So where he
Interesting. I
goes,
wasn't aware of that. I really thought
yeah.
about the artillery shells and kind of his long-standing.
Nah, that was Prigozhin's cover story. Very, very sociopathic individual, obviously very self-serving in his accounts. But I'm not saying everything he said was a lie. All skilled sociopaths are good at, framing things in their own terms, right? So maybe there were fewer shells, but the bottom line was it was about money. I mean, that was the main reason Prigozhin was pissed, is money and the fact that the MOD did not like Wagner getting so big. They wanted to cut them down to size. Obviously, they weren't happy about the F up of Kashin either. So that obviously did some damage to Russian prestige as well. The fact that, you know, these guys went off half cocked, and even the Americans called the Russian MOD on the hotline in Syria and said, "Hey, are these your guys?" And the Russian MOD basically disavowed them and said, "No, these aren't ours," which basically was a death sentence for these guys, a lot of them. Although I do think the body count was probably slightly exaggerated. From what the AP could only verify, about maybe a dozen KIA, but obviously I've heard the real number was probably in the high scores of Russian guys who got killed.
Yeah, I remember.
bombs.
I think Fritz on his Telegram channel posted it was like 65 guys got killed. It wasn't 200 or whatever the Western media claimed.
Yeah,
I mean,
that
still
sounds
wasn't
about
great.
right.
It was like a company size loss, not a
Yeah.
battalion.
Yeah, and I get the whole thing just strikes me as either some kind of provocation that somebody cooked up because they weren't happy that Trump before that was talking about maybe pulling the U.S. troops back, if not pulling them out of Syria completely, and they wanted to create an incident and say, "Hey, look, it's if we got these magical force fields around our FOBs. There's no vulnerability, Trump. There's no casualties. Look, we kicked ass. We can stay there as long as we want." There's no risk to our troops from, you know, keeping them in Syria indefinitely. And obviously, some American presence did go all the way through the fall of Assad. There still are probably, I don't know, maybe 200-300 guys left in Syria right now as we speak. And this is how many years later. So it's definitely a question of, you know, for me, it still smells like, if not a false flag, then some kind of green flag operation, if you will. Obviously, October 7th was a green flag from Netanyahu, somebody around Netanyahu, if not he himself, let it happen. But you know, we're in a period where obviously I wanted to get your thoughts because we're coming up on closing time here, and you probably have to go there as well soon. But your thoughts on the Tomahawks thing? Do you really think that's going to happen, or you think that's a Trump bluff to try to scare the Russians back to the negotiating table?
I think the
Tomahawks for
Tomahawks
Ukraine.
probably already got sent over, and Trump's announcement was just to publicize what had already been accomplished. You know, and he's still hoping there can be a negotiated settlement, which, you know, for reasons we both understand, is very unlikely.
Yeah. I mean, it's obvious to me that Putin finally just taking the gloves off, like the Russian Ministry of Defense and the hardliners have all demanded he do. I read John Helmer, who is the oldest, for those in the audience who don't know, John Helmer, Helmer, is the longest standing Western correspondent in Russia, partly self-funded. He's been there since like 1990. He's been in Moscow, so he's pretty much lived most of his life in Russia. Before that, he was in, let's say, Greek and American leftist circles. But Helmer basically said that Putin had been holding back the Kremlin hardliners for too long, and they finally prevailed on him after the Ukrainian, not only the attacks and the bombers, obviously, which was a big red line because of the dual-use nuclear capability of those bombers, but also the attacks in the Russian refining complex, which is finally costing, you know, the oligarchs significant, you know, the big money people in Moscow significant amounts of money to fix those refineries, even if they, you know, the damage to them is probably exaggerated to some degree. But it is costing them money, and eventually it could lead to at least the Russian Far East regions having to import gasoline refined from China, from the Chinese side of the border, and maybe even who knows, from India as well, via the Murmansk, you know, from the northern ports that are not subject to getting squeezed by NATO as much as the Baltic ports. So, I mean, Putin, from what I've seen, finally took the gloves off and blew the hell out of the Ukrainian grid this week, because it's like he's saying, hey, you know, we could have done a lot more damage to the Ukrainian infrastructure than we have. You know, the whole fraternal, I think it's a lot of reasons. Obviously, maybe there were certain tacit understandings at the start of the conflict that we won't bomb the shit out of your grid if you won't attack our refineries. And there was still gas flowing through Ukraine from Russia, or at least the Turk Stream. I've heard there have been Ukrainian attempts to attack Turk Stream, but maybe, you know, a deal was negotiated behind the scenes through Ankara and Istanbul that wouldn't be done. So the gas, at least Russian gas, would still get to southeastern Europe, via the Turk Stream. And now that maybe deal is off. So, now it's like part of what disturbs me about this conflict is that the fact that it's becoming so drone based kind of implies a fight to the finish, sort of like when the Nazi Germans bombed Coventry or bombed certain cities in England by mistake, or gave up on bombing the RAF bases, even when they were pushing the RAF to its limits. And then the area bombing of German cities began, right, by Al bomber hammers. With drones, you don't really have to maintain. You can have a very, very porous front line. You can kind of drag out the conflict. It equalizes in the sense that it helps weaker powers stand up to stronger powers. But the people don't talk about the dark side, which is that it makes fighting to the quote unquote last Ukrainian far more feasible, right? You see what I'm saying? It makes infrastructure busting war to the bottom, race to the bottom, far more feasible for the civilians, increases the civilian suffering on both sides. You see what I'm saying? Versus just if the front just finally collapsed and the civilians, either the ones who didn't want to live under Russian rule, just left and went westward, versus the conflict dragging out for years and years and years in this meat grinder, because the drone has sort of become like what the machine gun and barbed wire was to World War One. Although the front is not as stereotypically static as people think. They think it's like the trenches facing each other in World War One. The trench lines you had all the way from the Swiss border all the way to the North Sea, and the English Channel. And that's not the case, right? The front lines have become so porous to the point where you have these 2- and 3-man Russian squads infiltrating on dirt bikes and go-karts, and even mopeds or whatever carts, and they're getting behind the Ukrainian lines and flanking these meat shield conscripts who are basically there to be a speed bump to protect as a meat shield for the elite Ukrainian drone operators, right, who are 5, 10, even probably going further now, 15 kilometers back from the front, the immediate zero line, right? So it's a kind of race to the bottom, and I don't like that aspect of it. And I also don't like, obviously, the Tomahawk missiles. I suspect there's really no way those can be deployed without NATO personnel. Now, I think it's possible for the Ukrainians to fire them with Dutch or possibly British crews operating them, the ground launchers, but I don't believe there's any way in hell they can do it totally independently without NATO boots on the ground, which obviously have already been there for some time.
Yes, I mean the United States sent personnel over as early as April 2022.
Right, and there were British SAS in Kiev
Yes.
when the Russians were on the outskirts. We know that some of them were participating, if not directly pulling triggers, then we're certainly with frontline Ukrainian special operations units.
Yes, definitely. And a lot of the, like you said, a lot of the high-tech equipment, HIMARS, the Tomahawk missiles, that sort of stuff, it's all being done with American or British operators.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, let me put it to you this way. I don't think that you can just suddenly claim that the crew of a Typhoon Tomahawk ground launcher, of which the United States, as far as I know, only has maybe a dozen, maybe 2 dozen in the inventory, the entire military's inventory right now. I don't think you can just say, well, they just died in some, bus accident in the Philippines nobody saw, right? To explain when an Iskander blows the Typhoon launcher to bits, right? And you got a bunch of charred bodies and closed casket funerals. I mean, the ability of NATO to hush up its casualties and suppress. I know there were disgruntled French generals who were talking a few months back about naming names of French active duty Frenchmen who've died, not just foreign legionnaires who were, Polish or Ukrainian origin, who quote unquote fell, volunteered. We're talking about highly technical, French personnel here in intelligence or in, who are operating the surface-to-air missile systems or radars and electronic warfare systems. That it's not so easy to train a Ukrainian on, right? You can't do that overnight. I know there was grumbling among the French generals several months back that they were going to name names. Macron somehow shushed that up. I don't know how he did, but it amazes me, Nemets, that they've managed to keep a lid on the disavowed NATO combatant deaths this long. I feel like if Russia really wanted to wage information warfare the way that the West often claims Russia does, that it's really good at information warfare when it's not really that good at it, that there would be like websites registered in Vietnam or, some random African country that would basically be like NATO body count or NATO proof of life. And you'd have a whole list of basically guys with headshots and photos of them. I mean, I know there's track a Nazi Merc and there's different pro-Russian Telegram channels that claim that, these guys all either have recently discharged service or previously discharged service and have died. But you don't see, let's say, the Raytheon contractors. You don't see people whose deaths are going to be very, very, very hard to explain as not disavowable as just simple grunt trigger pullers, but as obviously people who were there in some contractor or NATO official capacity.
Yes. There's kind of an interesting, this might have been going on.
Because I think that's, not to interrupt, but I think that's one of the last cards Putin can play before the Tomahawks start flying at St. Petersburg or Moscow, is like saying, okay, let's cut the shit. Here are your guys. Here's a list of them. Macron, provide proof of life of these Frenchmen. Tell me that they didn't die in Odessa, right? Like, come on.
Well, that's why I think going back to, the Second Iraq War, maybe earlier, the U.S. Army, at least, they go and they'll pass off, combat deaths as deaths in, as training accidents.
Right.
So like a few months ago, there were, I think, 2 soldiers that they died in a training accident in Lithuania, and they supposedly lost their bodies.
Just drove into a swamp and drowned. Yeah. Like who
exactly.
the F drives an armored vehicle right into a Lithuanian swamp? Now, possible, yes. It's possible.
And there's a lot of stuff. It's been going on since 2022. So the Army kind of has done its work. They do have a process for covering up these combat deaths, enough that it'll provide plausible deniability, that these guys are not actually in Ukraine. And that's helped because the media doesn't like reporting on it either. They have.
Well, it's a mixed bag because they will report on the guys who overtly volunteered, right? They'll almost give them like the Iraq War faces of the fallen treatment, but they never dig too deeply. They never delve into, let's say, the non-trigger puller deaths. They don't ask too many questions about. Just to give you another example, that you've probably seen on X, the retired, was it Marine Corps general who was found dead in 29 Palms barracks? Just random heart attack, right? Found him somewhere in the barracks in 29 Palms, who'd been going to Ukraine for several months before that. Nobody asks too many questions about that. Nobody approaches the relatives. And you have to wonder, at what point do we realize some people are being either threatened or paid for their silence, right? Like, are the families being told, don't raise a stink, don't ask questions, or you won't get the death benefits, right? Like, that's got to be going on at some point.
Yes, I agree. I'm not sure the families are always aware where their, paterfamiliases are, though.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. In fairness, people can be pretty vague about where they're at, but I'm just saying, like, there's got to be a lot of stuff that I feel like the Russians have been holding up their sleeve as sort of the next to last resort before the next round of escalation. Because look, I mean, Peter, okay, after Tomahawks, what's left is escalation. Like, what, F-22s? We're going to give F-22s to the Ukrainian Air Force and pretend that those aren't American pilots flying them, while the aircraft are hiding on the Polish and Romanian side of the borders, because that's the only reason. Most of the F-16s haven't been destroyed on the ground yet, is they jump jet them, they hide them, at the Romanian air base, and then they fly low altitude, across the border, and then land and refuel and arm up for their missions, and then they fly back. They don't stay overnight at a lot of these bases. They're basically pit stops, like IndyCar pit stops. But and that's an old tactic NATO is borrowing from the North Vietnamese, and before them the North Korean Air Force did that with the bases in China, which the U.S. sometimes bombed, sometimes didn't. But the point being that, I mean, you wonder how much longer, like, there's only 2 more rungs up the escalation ladder. Maybe it's F-22s before you get to what we're going to give the Ukrainians tactical nukes next. I mean, you're running out of rungs in the escalation ladder that have plausible deniability. And I don't even think that Tomahawks are that deniable. I mean, other than Trump saying, well, maybe some of our NATO allies are there. He might admit it in a kind of sly way. But you're running out of rungs in the escalation ladder and things, ways of even quasi plausible deniability, in my view. So that's how I see it. Your closing thoughts, sir, before we have you back on in a couple weeks.
It was very nice speaking with you. I hope we speak again. Maybe we could go more in detail about prehistory, Canadian issues, or
yeah, I do want to talk to you more about Canada next time.
Yes,
for sure. Okay, so your closing. Could you please repeat for the audience how to find you on Substack and X?
Hey, so you guys can find me on Substack at nemets.substack.com, or on Twitter, I'm Peter Nemets, with Nemets spelled like the Admiral from the Pacific War.
Excellent. And by the way, that's a fine museum in Central Texas for anybody who's ever been to Fredericksburg. I highly encourage you to visit it. The Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, named after Chester A. Nimitz. So that's it for today, folks. We've been very pleased to have Peter on, talking all things Slavic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We promise next time we will give him more run for discussing ancient civilizations and also Canada. We'll get his thoughts on Canada, because a lot of you Matthew Arrett listeners in particular will probably want to get his take on what's going to happen with Canada, with Alberta in the coming years and decades beyond Trump and beyond Mark Carney. So stay tuned for that. We'll have him back on probably the next 2 weeks, when we'll be using Restream instead of StreamYard, which will be spreading this recording far wider across our channels, including potentially Mr. Nemets' Substack directly next time. So stay tuned. We'll place an announcement on the X feed of when we're going to have Peter back on. So thank you very much for your time, folks, and keep it tuned right here.